I am Ethan. I am 35 years old. And for an entire decade of my adult life, my only recognized purpose within my own family was to serve as a human ATM for my older brother. I funded his lifestyle, I funded his mistakes, and I funded his absolute delusions, all while I lived on the ragged edge of poverty. The breaking point didn't come with an apology or a moment of clarity. It came on a Tuesday night right inside my own dining room, while I was serving a dinner I had paid for and cooked, trying my absolute best to keep the fragile peace. My father looked me dead in the eye and said the words that would burn our family tree to the ground. He told me that my brother and his family were moving into my home that weekend. Not asking, telling. They looked at me not as a son, not as a brother, but as a real estate asset they could claim. But there was one massive, catastrophic detail they did not know. I had security cameras installed inside my home, and I had crystal clear, high-definition footage of exactly what my golden child brother had been doing in my private office while the rest of them were sitting comfortably in my living room drinking my wine. They were about to learn that the Bank of Ethan was officially, permanently closed. Before I tell you exactly what was on that tape and how I executed a plan to disappear completely, please hit that like button if you believe in justice and boundaries. And please let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Your support means the world to me. Now, let's go back to the exact second the illusion of my family shattered. The air in my dining room was thick with the rich, heavy smell of my mother's signature pot roast. It was a dish she insisted on bringing over, and historically, it was a dish she only ever made when she was about to ask for something completely unreasonable. I was sitting at the head of the table of the 3-bedroom house I had purchased just a year prior. It was a modest home in a quiet, working-class neighborhood, bought with literal blood, sweat, and years of extreme, soul-crushing frugality. My parents, Arthur and Eleanor, sat to my left. My older brother Julian, who was 38, and his wife Qley sat to my right. Julian had always been the golden child of the family. He was charming, he was loud, he was the life of the party, and he was entirely allergic to hard work. Qley was a woman who spent significantly more time curating her social media aesthetic than engaging with reality. Together, they were a financial black hole. We were halfway through the meal when the trap was sprung. My dad started the conversation by setting his fork down with a heavy thud against the ceramic plate. It was a sound designed to demand absolute silence from the table. He cleared his throat. He looked at me with that authoritative, unquestionable stare he used to end arguments before they even began. He said that he and my mother had been talking. He said Julian had hit a bit of a rough patch with his current housing situation. I chewed my food slowly, keeping my face completely neutral. A rough patch for Julian usually meant he had spent his rent money on something ridiculous and was facing a very real eviction. My dad continued, his voice taking on a tone of deep entitlement. He pointed out that since I had a 3-bedroom house and it was just me living there alone, Julian, Qley, and their 2 kids were going to move in. He said I had extra rooms and it just made financial sense. He finished his decree by stating that family shares what they have. I looked across the table. I looked at my mother, who was nodding vigorously, a strained, hopeful smile plastered on her face. I looked at Julian, who was actively staring at his plate with a smug little smirk, entirely avoiding my eyes because he knew exactly what was happening. Qley was already scrolling through her phone, probably looking up expensive paint colors to remodel my guest room. They didn't ask me. They demanded it. They had already packed their mental bags, hired the movers, and moved their entire lives into my sanctuary. I set my own fork down. I looked right at my father and I said the word no. Just one word. No. The silence that followed was absolute and suffocating. My mother gasped. A sharp, dramatic intake of breath like I had just cursed loudly in a church during a funeral. My dad's face immediately reddened. He leaned forward, placing both hands flat on the table. He told me that I do not say no to family. He stated clearly that they were not asking me for a favor. They were telling me what was going to happen because my brother needed a place to stay. I stood up from the table. My heart was pounding frantically against my ribs, a primal drumbeat of pure adrenaline, but my hands were completely steady. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my smartphone, and tapped the screen to connect it to the smart TV mounted on the dining room wall. I looked down at them. I kept my voice eerily, terrifyingly calm. I agreed with my father. I told him he was right, I did have extra rooms. But I also informed them that I had security cameras. I explained I had installed them after someone stole a package off my porch last month. And then I said the sentence that made the blood drain from Julian's face. I said the funny thing about indoor cameras is what they catch when you think absolutely no one is watching. I pressed play on my phone. The large television screen flickered to life. It displayed the black and white night vision footage of my home office from just 30 minutes ago, right after they had arrived at my house for dinner. The figure on the screen was unmistakable. It was Julian. He was quietly, meticulously opening the locked drawers of my heavy filing cabinet. The camera zoomed in slightly. He pulled out a thick manila folder. Even on the security camera, the bold black label was perfectly clear. It was the deed to my house and my complete financial portfolio. We all sat there in silence, watching the screen as my brother snapped dozens of high-resolution pictures of my mortgage documents, my bank statements, and my social security card with his phone before carefully sliding the folder back into the drawer and shutting it. The dining room was dead silent. The only sound was the low hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. I turned to my brother. I asked him exactly what he was looking for. I asked him if he was planning to steal my identity, or if he was just trying to figure out exactly how much equity I had in the property so he could pressure our parents to force me into taking out a massive home equity loan to fund his lifestyle. Julian went completely pale. His jaw worked up and down. He opened his mouth, but absolutely nothing came out. Qley dropped her phone. It clattered loudly against the hardwood floor. My mother was the first to break the silence. But she didn't yell at Julian. She turned her fury on me. She shrieked, completely ignoring the fact that her eldest, perfect son was caught red-handed committing a felony. She demanded to know how I dare spy on them. She accused me of recording my own flesh and blood. I fired back, my voice echoing off the walls of the home I paid for. I told her he was violating my privacy and taking photos of my highly sensitive legal documents. I explicitly called it attempted fraud, and I asked her how her first reaction could possibly be to yell at me for catching a thief in my own home. My dad bellowed, slamming his fist on the table so hard the water glasses shook. He claimed Julian was just stressed. He said Julian was just exploring his financial options. He told me I had absolutely no right to humiliate my brother like this in front of his wife. I walked directly to the front door. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled it wide open, letting the cold night air rush into the house. I stated clearly that my options did not include funding his life for another single second. I told them dinner was officially over. I ordered all of them to get out of my house immediately. They eventually left, sputtering wild insults and screaming threats about how I was single-handedly destroying the family unit. But as the door clicked shut and I threw the deadbolt locked, the adrenaline slowly faded, leaving behind a cold, hard, undeniable truth. That security footage was just the final straw. The real rot in this family, the true disease that had infected my entire life, didn't start tonight. It started exactly 10 years ago. When I was in my early 20s, I fundamentally believed the lie my parents had brainwashed into me since childhood. I believed that unconditional love meant unconditional financial support. I was the quiet kid growing up. I was the responsible one who did his homework while Julian threw massive house parties. I was the one who got a minimum wage retail job at 16 to pay for my own clothes, while Julian was actively encouraged by my parents to spend his time finding his passion. By the time I was 24, my life was a relentless, exhausting grind. I was working full-time retail during the day, dealing with screaming customers, and taking grueling coding boot camps late at night. I lived in a terrible, run-down one-bedroom apartment in the bad part of town. The radiator sounded like a dying animal, the roof leaked every time it rained, and I was eating cheap instant ramen and meal prepping generic rice and beans just to afford my basic internet bill for my classes. I had zero social life. Every penny was accounted for. Julian, at 27, suddenly decided he wanted to go back to a private college for a liberal arts degree. He had already maxed out multiple high-interest credit cards and unsurprisingly could not get approved for the massive private student loans he needed to cover the ridiculous tuition. That was when the first major manipulation occurred. My parents cornered me on a quiet Sunday afternoon. They sat me down and told me that Julian was finally turning his life around. They promised, they swore on everything holy, that if I just co-signed his $30,000 student loan, it would be a mere formality. My mother had actually cried real tears. She pleaded with me, telling me he just needed my pristine credit score. She begged me not to stand in the way of my brother's precious education and his bright future. Against every single instinct in my body, I co-signed. I signed my name on the dotted line, effectively chaining my entire financial future to a man who had never finished a single project he started. Julian lasted exactly 2 semesters. He dropped out because he claimed the professors were stifling his unique creativity. And exactly as I had feared, he never made a single payment on that massive loan. The aggressive collection agencies started calling my phone daily. To protect my own credit score, to keep my desperate dreams of ever buying real estate or getting a decent corporate job alive, I started paying his debt. While he was actively posting photos on social media of himself drinking expensive margaritas on a sunny beach in Cancun, I was taking extra weekend graveyard shifts at a freezing warehouse just to cover his $350 monthly payment. Whenever I brought this massive injustice up to my parents, the script was always exactly the same. They would tell me he is struggling. They would tell me I am doing so well and to just have some basic compassion. That forced compassion cost me a decade of my youth. The real turning point, the agonizing moment the blinders truly started to come off my eyes, happened when I was 29. I had finally, after years of grinding, landed a solid job as a software engineer. I was making a decent salary. I was aggressively contributing to a 401k and actively saving every spare dollar for a down payment on a house. I had managed to scrape together a savings account that felt like a warm shield against a cruel world. Julian, meanwhile, had married Qley. Qley styled herself as a high-end lifestyle influencer, despite having fewer actual followers than my local corner bakery. Together, they formed a terrifying black hole of mindless consumption. Julian grandly announced to the family that he was starting an elite consulting business. He needed seed money immediately. The banks quite literally laughed at his business plan. So, my parents came directly to me. My dad called me and casually stated that Julian needed $15,000. He called it Julian's big break. He claimed Julian had wealthy investors lined up, and he just needed the initial capital to secure a luxury office space. He told me to consider it a high-yield investment. He promised Julian would pay me back with interest within 6 months. I fought them tooth and nail for weeks. I explained clearly that this was my house money. This was my emergency fund. But my mother escalated the tactics. She showed up at my cheap apartment crying hysterically. She told me that I was actively ruining Julian's new marriage by not supporting his ambitions. She accused me of being deeply jealous of his potential. She wore me down day after day until, completely exhausted by the relentless emotional abuse, I logged into my bank and transferred the money. $15,000. Gone in a single click. 3 months later, I drove over to their rented luxury townhouse to see how the supposed consulting business was doing. I expected to see a home office, maybe some printed marketing materials, or at least a desk. Instead, parked right in their driveway, gleaming aggressively in the afternoon sun, was a pristine, slightly used Porsche Macan. I walked into the house, my blood physically boiling in my veins. Julian was sitting deeply sunk into the couch playing video games on a massive new television. Qley was sitting on the floor unboxing expensive designer handbags for a video. I asked about the car outside. My voice was trembling with suppressed rage. I asked how the consulting business was doing. Julian didn't even bother to pause his game. He casually tossed over his shoulder that they had pivoted. He said consulting was a dead end. He then had the absolute audacity to say that Qley needed the Porsche for her brand image. He quoted that you have to spend money to make money. I felt physically sick. I asked him directly if he used my life savings to buy a luxury SUV. Qley chimed in, not even looking up from her phone screen. She told me it was a valid business expense. She told me not to be so dramatic and promised they would pay me back when her brand deals finally took off. They never paid me back. The consulting business never existed in any legal capacity. They had blatantly used my life savings to fund their pathetic delusion of grandeur. I left their house that day and drove home in a complete daze. I walked into my apartment, sat at my cheap, wobbly IKEA desk, opened my laptop, and created a highly detailed spreadsheet. I titled the document, The ATM. I went back through years of bank statements, old emails, and text messages. I logged the student loan payments. I logged the $15,000 fake investment. I logged the $2,000 I gave them when their dog ate a sock and needed emergency surgery. I logged the $5,000 I contributed to their lavish wedding because my parents begged me to help them secure the dream venue. I tracked every single penny meticulously, and when I hit the sum function at the bottom of the column, the number stared back at me, violently mocking my blind, stupid loyalty. $60,000. That was the exact price of my family's love. That was the dollar amount of the life I had been brutally denied so that Julian could play pretend. I didn't confront them right away. I knew confronting them without immense leverage was entirely useless. Instead, I went completely silent. I stopped offering to pay for family dinners. I stopped answering my phone on the first ring. I focused entirely on my career. I worked late nights, I worked weekends, taking on every complex, demanding project my company threw at me. My salary climbed. I got a massive promotion to lead engineer. I finally, after years of delay, bought my house. I built my sanctuary. I thought by establishing physical distance and firmly refusing new financial requests, I could maintain a superficial, polite relationship with them. I thought the worst of the abuse was over. I was so incredibly wrong. The real storm was just gathering off the coast, and it was about to make landfall. The hurricane that ultimately destroyed my family didn't start with a scream. It started with a casual Sunday lunch ambush. This happened exactly 3 months before the security camera incident that ended it all. I had reluctantly agreed to go to my parents' house for lunch, a tradition I had started to deeply dread but attended out of a misplaced sense of duty. The atmosphere in their home was thick and tense from the exact moment I walked through the front door. My mother was nervously wiping down the spotless kitchen counters with a frantic energy. My dad was sitting stiffly in his leather recliner, his jaw clenched tight. Julian and Qley were sitting close together on the love seat, looking like tragic victims of a terrible natural disaster. I sat down in the armchair across from them. I didn't bother with small talk. I asked what was going on. My mother sat on the edge of the heavy oak coffee table, wringing her hands together. She looked at me with sad eyes and announced that Julian had been let go from his job at the logistics firm. I didn't flinch. I didn't offer sympathy. This was the 3rd time Julian had been fired in a single calendar year. I plainly said okay, and asked what happened this time. Qley crossed her arms defensively and stated that his manager was deeply threatened by his natural leadership skills. I almost laughed out loud at the absurdity. I asked if he was applying for unemployment. My dad leaned forward, resting his heavy elbows on his knees. He used his deep, booming voice to inform me that standard unemployment was not going to cover their lifestyle. He listed off their expenses like they were my problem. The luxury townhouse rent, the massive car payments for the Porsche, the elite private preschool for Tyler and Madison. He declared that Julian needed time to comfortably find a position that truly respected his high level of expertise. I felt the familiar, icy cold dread pooling deep in my stomach. I asked what they wanted from me. My mother spoke softly, her voice dripping with calculated vulnerability. She said they just needed me to help them out temporarily. She said they had done the math. She looked me in the eye and requested that I transfer Julian $5,000 a month for the next 6 months. She claimed it would keep them afloat while he networked. $5,000 a month. They were sitting in my parents' living room, calmly asking for virtually my entire disposable income. They were demanding that I halt my life, drain my investments, pause my future, to pay for an expensive apartment I didn't live in and a luxury Porsche I didn't drive. I looked at all four of them. I took a deep breath and I said the word no. Just one word. Flat, cold, and utterly definitive. Julian finally looked up. His eyes flashed with a manufactured, theatrical anger. He scoffed loudly. He asked if I was really just going to let my own flesh and blood drown without even throwing a life preserver. I felt the years of repressed anger rising in my throat. I raised my voice. I told him he wasn't drowning. I told him he was sitting in a luxury yacht that he intentionally punched holes in, and now he was demanding I bail out the water with my bare hands. I stated absolutely that I was not giving him a single dime. My dad roared. He stood up, using his imposing height to try and intimidate me, a physical tactic that hadn't worked since I was a scared teenager. He pointed a thick finger at my chest. He yelled that he knew I was making a six-figure salary. He yelled that I had a massive house. He accused me of hoarding my wealth while my own family suffered. He ordered me to help my brother. I stood up instantly, matching his aggressive stance. The fear was entirely gone, replaced by pure, blinding clarity. I told him that my salary was the direct result of me working 60-hour weeks while his golden child played video games. I told him my house was the result of me eating rice and beans for years while Julian vacationed in luxury resorts in Mexico. I declared that my money was mine. I reached into my inside jacket pocket and pulled out several folded sheets of crisp white paper. I had meticulously printed the spreadsheet that very morning, anticipating an ambush. I walked over and dropped the papers right onto the center of the coffee table. My mother asked what it was, picking it up with trembling fingers. I pointed a firm finger at the document. I told her that was an itemized, date-stamped receipt of my love for this family. I ordered her to read the total at the very bottom of the page. She looked down. Her eyes scanned the numbers. Her face drained of all color, turning a sickly shade of gray. She whispered the number out loud. $60,000. I looked right at Julian, who was suddenly intensely fascinated by the pattern of the rug. I confirmed the number. I listed the major hits out loud so no one could deny them. $30,000 for the student loans he defaulted on, destroying my credit. $15,000 for the fake consulting business that magically transformed into his wife's Porsche. $5,000 for his lavish wedding. Thousands more in random bailouts and emergencies. I stated as a matter of absolute fact that I had funded his entire adult existence. My dad tried to rally. He shouted that it was family, and that family helps family. His voice was loud, but it lacked its usual terrifying certainty. I fired right back. I told him family supports each other. I told him parasites drain their hosts, and I announced that I was officially done being a host. Qley stood up, her face red, pointing a perfectly manicured finger at me. She called me selfish. She weaponized her children, screaming, asking how they were supposed to feed their kids. I looked at her with absolute disgust. I told her to sell the Porsche. I told her to cancel the elite private preschool. I told her to get a job and do what actual adults do when they run out of money. My dad stepped right into my personal space, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple with uncontrollable rage. He leaned in and spoke very carefully. He told me that I was going to wire that money to my brother by tomorrow morning, or else. I didn't step back an inch. I challenged him. I asked, or else what? He delivered his ultimate ultimatum. He said if I walked out that door, I shouldn't bother coming back. He declared I would be dead to this family until I learned some respect. He thought he was issuing a devastating threat. He thought he was playing his ultimate trump card, banking heavily on the deeply ingrained idea that I was desperate for their parental approval. He didn't realize he had just handed me the master key to my own prison cell. I looked around the room at the people who had treated me like a disposable bank account for a decade. I looked at my father and said the word, done. I turned on my heel and walked purposefully toward the front door. My mother cried out, dropping the papers onto the floor. She begged me to stop, begging me not to do this. I didn't turn around. I didn't hesitate. I opened the door, stepped out into the crisp autumn air, and shut it firmly behind me. I walked to my car, got in, and started the engine. For the first time in 10 long years, my chest didn't feel tight. The crushing, suffocating weight of endless guilt and obligation was completely gone. I felt lighter than air. That was the day the war officially started. And 3 months later, when they tried to ambush me at my own dining room table and demand my house, the security camera footage was just my way of dropping the final, undeniable bomb on their entitlement. The morning immediately following the security camera incident, my house felt like a fortified bunker. I woke up sharply at 6 a.m., my mind terrifyingly clear and completely devoid of doubt. I made a strong cup of black coffee and sat at my kitchen island in the quiet dawn. I knew my family's playbook. I knew they wouldn't just accept defeat and walk away gracefully. They viewed my boundaries not as a right, but as a severe personal insult, a challenge to be overcome through a sheer, relentless campaign of harassment. By exactly 8 a.m., my doorbell rang sharply. I didn't get up from my stool. I calmly pulled up the front porch camera feed on my phone. My mother, Eleanor, was standing on my porch. She looked highly disheveled, her hair unbrushed and her cardigan buttoned incorrectly. She wasn't carrying a physical weapon, but she was armed with something historically much worse. A rehearsed, tearful monologue of weaponized maternal guilt. She knocked. When I didn't answer, she pounded her fists against the wood. Then she started yelling right through the thick oak door. "Ethan, open this door right now. You are breaking your father's heart. Julian is your own brother. You cannot abandon us like this." I sat in my kitchen and watched her on the glowing screen. The neighbor across the street, Mrs. Higgins, the notoriously nosy president of our local HOA, was standing on her manicured lawn. She was holding a running hose, watering rose bushes that absolutely did not need watering, staring openly at the loud spectacle unfolding on my porch. My mother was putting on a calculated public show, banking heavily on the fact that I would open the door just to avoid the neighborhood embarrassment. I took a slow sip of my coffee. I opened my phone contacts and called Sarah, the aggressive, no-nonsense real estate agent who had helped me buy the house a year ago. She answered on the second ring. I didn't waste time. I told her I needed to list the house today. Sarah sounded shocked. She noted how fast this was happening and asked if everything was okay. I assured her everything was perfectly fine, but stressed that I needed to sell the property immediately. I told her I wanted a cash buyer and a lightning-fast closing. I explicitly stated I didn't care if we left a few $1,000s on the table. I just needed the asset liquidated and gone. By noon that exact same day, the heavy wooden for sale sign was pounded deep into my front lawn. My mother had finally given up her screaming and left around 9:30 a.m., but the psychological siege of my home had only just begun. At 2 p.m., the quiet of the afternoon was shattered. I heard the heavy, grinding mechanical noise of my garage door opening. My blood ran completely cold. I had meticulously changed all the deadbolts on the exterior doors that morning, but in the chaotic rush of the day, I had forgotten to reset the electronic exterior keypad for the garage. Julian had memorized that specific code 2 years ago when he borrowed my expensive lawnmower, a lawnmower he subsequently sold on Facebook Marketplace for quick cash and claimed was stolen. I grabbed a heavy, metal Maglite flashlight from the kitchen drawer, gripping it tightly, and walked silently into the hallway connecting to the mudroom. Julian confidently walked through the interior mudroom door, a smug, arrogant grin plastered on his face. He was wearing an expensive leather jacket I knew for a fact he couldn't afford on his non-existent salary. He sneered at me, asking if I was changing the locks and calling it real mature. I leveled a glare at him. I ordered him to get out of my house instantly, stating clearly that he was trespassing on private property. I raised the heavy flashlight just enough for him to see I was serious. He took a step forward, trying to use his bulk to look intimidating. He mocked me, asking if I was actually selling the house just to spite him. He said our dad was right and that I was completely out of my mind. I kept my voice completely devoid of any emotion. I told him I was liquidating an asset so I could move on with my life. I gave him exactly 10 seconds to leave before I dialed 911 and showed the responding officers the crystal-clear footage of him trying to steal my property deed the night before. His smug expression faltered instantly, the harsh reality of the felony footage hitting him again. He tried to play the victim, whining that I wouldn't do that to family. I looked right through him. I told him I didn't have a family. I told him I had a collection of financial parasites. I started counting down from 5. He backed away, his hands raised, cursing under his breath, and practically ran back out the garage. I immediately pulled the emergency release and disabled the electronic keypad permanently. The next day, the harassment escalated. It was Qley's turn to play her part in the script. She showed up at my front door, holding the hands of 7-year-old Tyler and 5-year-old Madison. They were completely innocent kids, dressed in worn-out clothes, being used as literal pawns in their parents' sick, manipulative game. I opened the heavy wooden door, but I kept the reinforced metal screen door locked shut between us. Tyler smiled up at me, though his little face looked deeply confused. He called me Uncle Ethan. I felt a sharp pang of genuine sorrow in my chest. I said hey to him softly. I genuinely loved my nephew and niece, but I knew I couldn't save them from the toxic environment their parents created. Qley immediately put on her best, award-winning crying face. Tears streamed down her cheeks. She begged me. She claimed the bank was threatening immediate foreclosure on their luxury townhouse. She sobbed, asking me if I really wanted my own niece and nephew to sleep in a freezing car because I was selling my house and leaving them. It was an absolute masterclass in extreme emotional blackmail, using innocent children to extort money from a relative. I didn't break eye contact with her. I spoke clearly so she couldn't misunderstand a single syllable. I told her that if they were truly facing homelessness, there were city shelters and government assistance programs available. But more importantly, I told her she could sell the luxury Porsche sitting in her driveway. I told her she could pawn her closet full of designer handbags. I explicitly commanded her not to ever put the burden of her terrible financial choices on my shoulders while holding her own children up as human shields on my front porch. I called her behavior exactly what it was: disgusting. Her fake, manufactured tears stopped instantly, drying up like magic. Her face twisted into a venomous, hateful glare. She hissed at me, calling me a monster. I replied calmly. I told her I was just a mirror, and she just didn't like the ugly reflection staring back at her. I closed the solid wooden door right in her face and locked the deadbolt. The local housing market was incredibly hot, thanks to Sarah's aggressive networking and the pristine condition of the property. I accepted an all-cash offer 5% over the asking price within 48 hours of listing. The buyers wanted to move fast. We closed the entire deal in record time. I packed my entire life into a single, rented moving truck in the dead of night. I didn't want any dramatic, tearful goodbyes. I didn't want my father showing up with his manufactured rage to physically block the driveway. As I sat high up in the cab of the moving truck, the heavy diesel engine rumbling powerfully beneath me, I pulled out my phone one last time. I went into my settings. I permanently blocked my mother, my father, Julian, and Qley across every single social media platform and communication app. I sent an email to my cell carrier and completely changed my phone number. I wiped my digital footprint as clean as I possibly could. I put the heavy truck in drive and pulled out of the quiet neighborhood, watching the house I had fought so hard for fade into the darkness of my rearview mirror. I wasn't running away. I was driving towards Seattle. What my greedy family didn't know, what I had kept fiercely protected from their grasping hands during those long years of silent, exhausting grinding, was that I hadn't just been working my corporate day job. I had been obsessively coding a highly complex, proprietary software platform on nights and weekends. A major tech startup based in Seattle had just acquired the exclusive licensing rights to my code, and as part of the massive buyout, I had been brought on as the lead architect with significant equity in the company. I was about to become wealthier than my toxic family could ever possibly comprehend. I thought I had left the poison behind in my rearview mirror. I truly thought that cutting them off financially and physically meant the war was finally over. But family has a terrifyingly funny way of tracking you down when there's real money on the line. And they were about to make the biggest, most humiliating mistake of their entire miserable lives. For the first 6 months after I arrived in Seattle, my life was a symphony of absolute, unbroken silence. And by silence, I mean the profound, healing absence of manufactured emergencies. I woke up every single morning in a modern, sunlit high-rise apartment overlooking the cold, gray waters of the Puget Sound. And for the first time in a decade, I did not check my phone with a sickening sense of impending dread. There were no frantic, early morning text messages demanding that I cover a bounce check for a luxury car. There were no emotionally manipulative voicemails from my mother, weeping into the receiver and claiming my father's blood pressure was dangerously high strictly because of my immense selfishness. There was just the steady, rhythmic sound of the Seattle rain against the thick glass, the smell of premium coffee that I bought entirely for myself, and the quiet, solid certainty that my money, my precious time, and my sanity finally belonged entirely to me. The tech startup that had originally acquired my proprietary software platform was growing at an absolutely exponential, dizzying rate. During the aggressive buyout negotiations before I even left my hometown, I did not just blindly hand over the complex code for a flat, one-time fee. I knew the immense, industry-disrupting value of what I had painstakingly built during those long, miserable, lonely nights at my cheap IKEA desk back home. I had negotiated a massive equity stake in the newly formed corporate entity and secured my position at the absolute top of the corporate hierarchy. My new salary was staggering, a number so large it felt almost fictional the first time it hit my bank account. The promotion to lead architect and managing partner gave me a level of executive authority I had never experienced in my entire life. I was no longer the quiet, easily manipulated younger brother who ate ramen to pay someone else's debts. I was making executive decisions that moved millions of dollars across international borders. I was building a completely new reality from the ground up. It was during this period of intense, consuming professional growth that I met Evelyn. She was a high-level corporate consultant hired by our board of directors to help streamline our rapidly expanding overseas operations. Evelyn was brilliant, razor-sharp, and carried herself with a quiet, undeniable confidence that completely captivated me from the moment she walked into the boardroom. We started having quick coffees in the executive break room, which seamlessly turned into long, luxurious dinners at upscale restaurants downtown, which very quickly evolved into a deep, meaningful, and intensely protective partnership. One rainy evening, sitting by the fireplace in my apartment, I told her everything about my past. I laid out the entire ugly truth. I told her about Julian, the golden child. I explained the decade of relentless financial abuse. I told her about the $60,000, the fake consulting business, the luxury SUV, and my dramatic middle-of-the-night escape across the country. I braced myself for the usual societal response. I expected her to play the devil's advocate. Evelyn did not judge me. She did not offer empty, toxic platitudes about how family is everything and blood is thicker than water. She simply looked at me from across the coffee table, reached out to hold my hand, and validated every single boundary I had set. She told me I had survived a decade of sophisticated emotional extortion, and that my current success was the ultimate, undeniable proof of my incredible resilience. With Evelyn standing firmly by my side, I felt truly invincible. I felt like the massive, invisible fortress I had built around my new life was completely impenetrable to the ghosts of my past. But invincibility is a very dangerous illusion. It breeds a very specific, insidious kind of complacency. The catastrophic breach in my carefully constructed armor did not come from a direct, loud frontal assault by my parents. They didn't know where I was. The breach came quietly, through a smiling Trojan horse named Leo. Leo was my first cousin on my father's side of the family. Growing up, Leo and I had always been relatively close. We played baseball together as kids. He was the only person in the entire extended family who ever seemed to recognize, even slightly, how unfairly Julian was treated compared to me. When I executed my escape plan and systematically cut off my immediate family, I did not block Leo's number or his social media profiles. I genuinely, foolishly believed he was a safe harbor, a distant, harmless connection to my roots that carried absolutely no toxic baggage. Right around my 8th month living in Seattle, Leo reached out to me via a professional business networking site. His message was entirely casual, completely non-threatening. He said his firm was flying him into Seattle for a massive commercial real estate conference and he wanted to grab a quick beer while he was in the city. He explicitly mentioned in the message that he completely understood why I had walked away from my parents, and he promised he would not bring a single ounce of family drama to my doorstep. He claimed he just wanted to catch up with his favorite cousin and hear about the new city. I desperately wanted to believe him. The human brain is evolutionarily hardwired to crave tribal connection, and despite my newfound strength and wealth, a small, deeply vulnerable part of me still wanted to have at least one single family member who was genuinely proud of what I had accomplished. I agreed to meet him at an upscale, dimly lit steakhouse just 3 blocks from my corporate office. The dinner started perfectly. It was comfortable and nostalgic. Leo was incredibly charming. He congratulated me warmly on my apparent success, his eyes taking careful note of my custom-tailored suit and the expensive, understated watch on my wrist. We talked about his career trajectory, the booming Seattle housing market, and our favorite sports teams. But by the time the expensive main courses arrived at the table, the natural flow of the conversation subtly, dangerously shifted. Leo's questions became highly specific, almost interrogative in nature, though disguised as friendly interest. He asked exactly what the name of my new tech company was. He asked what specific floor my office was located on. He asked how the building's security protocols worked for guests. He masterfully masked these invasive questions with feigned professional curiosity, claiming his firm was actively looking to invest in commercial properties in the downtown tech sector, and he just wanted to understand the landscape. Then, he leaned across the table, dropped his voice to a solemn whisper, and put on a terrifyingly convincing mask of deep, manufactured sorrow. He told me a tragic, elaborate story about a recent funeral on his mother's side of the family. He talked in vivid detail about how a sudden, unexpected death had triggered a massive, ugly legal battle over a heavily disputed inheritance. He looked me right in the eye, shaking his head sadly, and said the horrific experience made him realize how incredibly short life is, and how terrible it is when families stay fractured forever over silly misunderstandings. I should have seen the massive red flags waving violently in my face. I should have instantly recognized the classic, guilt-tripping manipulation tactics my own mother had perfected over decades. But the expensive wine, the good food, and my own dangerous, arrogant complacency severely clouded my judgment. I completely let my guard down. I told him the exact name of my corporate building. I even joked about how ridiculously strict our lobby security team was with unannounced visitors. We paid the massive bill, shook hands warmly on the rainy sidewalk, and parted ways. I went home to Evelyn that night feeling a warm, comforting sense of nostalgia, genuinely believing I had successfully reconnected with a safe, supportive family member. I had absolutely no idea that the exact second Leo stepped into the privacy of his hotel room, he picked up his smartphone and immediately called my father. Leo had not flown to Seattle for a real estate conference. He had been sent on a highly coordinated, fully funded reconnaissance mission. My parents had likely promised to pay off one of his own mounting credit card debts in exchange for finding my exact physical location. They had spent 8 miserable months stewing in their toxic rage, losing face in their pretentious social circles, and desperately struggling to fund Julian's lavish lifestyle without my bank account to silently drain. They were completely desperate, and desperate people do not respect boundaries. They obliterate them. The trap was fully, perfectly set. I had willingly handed them the exact GPS coordinates to my sanctuary on a silver platter. I went to sleep that night completely unaware that my past was currently boarding a direct, early morning flight to Seattle, armed with a decade of unearned entitlement and a desperate, ravenous hunger for my money. I thought I had outsmarted them. I was about to learn that toxic families do not ever surrender. They simply regroup, gather intelligence, and plan a significantly more destructive ambush. It was a perfectly ordinary, highly productive Tuesday morning when the absolute chaos finally erupted, shattering the peace I had spent nearly a year building. I was sitting in my top-floor executive office, leaning over my massive mahogany desk, meticulously reviewing a complex series of corporate acquisition documents. The panoramic view of the Seattle skyline through the floor-to-ceiling glass windows was absolutely stunning. The city bathed in a rare, brilliant morning sunlight. Evelyn was in a high-level financial strategy meeting just 2 doors down the hall. My life was perfectly ordered, highly profitable, and completely, undeniably under my control. At exactly 10:15 a.m., the private line on my desk phone buzzed sharply. It was Sarah, our incredibly professional lead receptionist stationed down in the main ground floor lobby. Her voice was uncharacteristically tight, layered with a very real sense of professional panic. She informed me, speaking quickly, that there was a highly agitated, very loud group of people in the main lobby explicitly demanding to see me immediately. She said they were aggressively claiming to be my immediate family. I felt a massive, heavy block of solid ice drop directly into the pit of my stomach. My breathing stopped for a fraction of a second. Sarah continued, her voice dropping to a harsh, urgent whisper so she wouldn't be overheard. She told me they were making a massive, embarrassing public scene. They were actively screaming at the front desk security guards. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of their plan was absolutely breathtaking. They had boarded a plane, flown thousands of miles across the entire country, tracked down my corporate headquarters using Leo's intel, and decided to stage a highly public, emotionally violent hostage situation in the middle of a prestigious financial district. They were heavily banking on the ultimate corporate fear, public scandal, and HR intervention. They assumed, based on the fact that I used to let them walk all over me, that I was just a mid-level, easily replaceable employee. They mathematically calculated that if they threatened to embarrass me in front of my powerful superiors, I would panic, rush down to the lobby in a cold sweat, and quietly write them a massive check just to make them go away and save my precious corporate job. They were operating on wildly outdated information and a spectacular, almost comical level of arrogance. I did not panic. The block of ice in my stomach hardened into cold, solid steel. I calmly told Sarah to step completely away from the reception desk, get behind the reinforced glass, and let the security team handle the perimeter. I hung up the phone with a decisive click and immediately pressed the speed dial button for Miller. Miller was our director of corporate security. He was a retired military police officer, a man built like a heavy steel vault door with absolutely zero tolerance for nonsense, theatrics, or threats to the executives. He answered on the very first ring. I told him we had a severe hostile intrusion in the main lobby. I stated clearly that it was my estranged family. They were actively attempting to extort me for money. They were threatening a baseless lawsuit, and I needed him to personally flank me while I dealt with the trash. Miller and I met at the executive elevator. We rode the glass car down to the ground floor in absolute predatory silence. The heavy elevator doors slid open with a soft, melodic chime. The main lobby of our building was an expansive, echoing cathedral of polished white marble, tinted glass, and brushed steel. And standing right in the absolute center of it, looking completely out of place, utterly unhinged and wildly erratic, were my father, my mother, Julian, and Qley. My father was bright red in the face, aggressively pointing a thick, shaking finger squarely into the chest of a very calm, very large security guard. My mother was clutching her cheap leather purse to her chest, putting on her absolute best, Oscar-worthy performance of weeping hysterically for an audience of bewildered tech employees. Julian stood slightly behind them, wearing an incredibly ill-fitting suit he probably bought a decade ago, trying desperately to look intimidating but mostly just looking sweaty and nervous. Qley, true to her parasitic nature, was actually holding her smartphone up high, clearly recording the entire chaotic interaction for whatever twisted social media narrative or legal leverage she thought she could manufacture. I stepped slowly out of the elevator. My heavy, custom-made leather shoes clicked sharply and rhythmically against the polished marble floor. Miller flanked my right side instantly, his posture rigid, his hands resting casually near his utility belt, radiating an aura of absolute, uncompromising command. My mother saw me first. She let out a piercing, theatrical scream that echoed off the high ceilings and rushed toward me, her arms outstretched like a martyr. "Ethan! Oh, my sweet, confused boy. Look what terrible things you have forced us to do to find you." Miller stepped smoothly and instantly in front of me, raising a massive, immovable hand. He told her in a low, rumbling voice that left absolutely no room for debate to maintain a strict 5-foot distance from Mr. Morrison. My mother recoiled violently, exactly as if she had been physically struck by a baseball bat. She looked at Miller with pure outrage. My father roughly pushed past her, his eyes wild with furious, unearned entitlement. He shouted at the top of his lungs that I could not hide behind highly paid rent-a-cops. He declared with absolute authority that I was going to stand right there in the lobby and listen to exactly what I had done to destroy this family. He proudly announced to the entire lobby of watching employees that Julian was facing imminent financial ruin, and that I was going to wire transfer $50,000 directly into his bank account today, or he was going to march directly into the Human Resources Department, find the CEO, and tell my boss exactly what kind of financial predator and sociopath they had working for them. Julian stepped forward then, deeply emboldened by my father's screaming. He demanded I stop embarrassing the family in public. He told me to just write the damn check right now so they could leave and I could save my pathetic career. He actually sneered at me, a disgusting twist of his lips, telling me that I fundamentally owed him this money for leaving them all in the lurch and causing his wife so much stress. I stood perfectly still. I did not flinch. I let their pathetic, desperate, echoing threats hang in the air of the high marble ceilings. I slowly looked at the security guards holding the tight perimeter. I looked at the terrified receptionist behind the glass. And then, I looked directly, piercingly into my father's eyes. I did not raise my voice a single decibel. I spoke with the cold, measured, surgical precision of a man who held absolutely all of the cards in the deck. I told them they had made a catastrophic, life-altering miscalculation. I stated that they came into this building explicitly assuming I was a fragile, entry-level employee terrified of corporate discipline. I explained slowly that they actually thought they could weaponize my career against me to line their own pockets. My father barked a harsh laugh, spitting as he spoke. He demanded someone call the CEO of the company immediately. He yelled that he wanted the man in charge down here right this second to fire me on the spot for severe insubordination, theft, and moral bankruptcy. I didn't answer him. I turned my head slightly toward my security director. I gave him a single, subtle nod. Miller stepped forward, closing the distance. He looked down at my father with absolute, crushing military contempt. He spoke loudly, his deep voice carrying perfectly across the entire expanse of the lobby. "Sir," Miller said, his tone dripping with authority, "you are currently trespassing on private corporate property. Furthermore, you are aggressively demanding to speak to the chief executive officer. You are currently looking directly at him. Mr. Ethan Morrison is the founder, the lead system architect, and the majority owner of this entire corporate division. There is absolutely no one above him in this building, or in this entire city, for you to complain to." The silence that crashed down on the lobby was absolute, heavy, and utterly magnificent. It was not just quiet. It was the deafening sound of a decade of toxic arrogance being entirely, permanently obliterated in a single, beautiful second. My father's jaw went completely slack. The angry, vibrant red color drained entirely from his face in an instant, leaving him looking pale, incredibly old, and suddenly very, very small. My mother stopped her fake, theatrical crying instantly. Her mouth opened and closed silently, like a fish suffocating on dry land on a dock. Julian looked wildly around the massive, incredibly expensive lobby, then looked back at my impeccably tailored suit, and finally truly comprehended the sheer magnitude of wealth, power, and untouchable status I had built entirely without his existence. He took a physical, stumbling step backward, his deep-seated arrogance completely shattered into dust. Qley slowly, shakingly lowered her smartphone. Her hands were trembling so violently I thought she might drop the device. The video she was recording was completely useless now. I stepped past Miller. I calmly closed the distance between myself and my father until I was mere inches from his face. I told him he had exactly 30 seconds to take his pathetic dependence and walk out the revolving glass doors. I promised him, with deadly sincerity, that if he was still standing on my marble floor on the 31st second, my elite legal team would file a massive, ruinous lawsuit against all four of them for criminal trespassing, corporate harassment, and felony attempted extortion. I told him I would drag them through civil court for years until they did not have a single dime left to their names, and then I would take their retirement funds. I looked at Julian, who was visibly shaking. I told him the Bank of Ethan was not just closed, it had been detonated. My father tried to speak. He tried desperately to summon his old, booming authoritarian voice to put me in my place, but only a pathetic, raspy croak came out of his throat. He looked at me, his eyes wide with fear, realizing in real time that he had absolutely zero power, zero leverage, and zero control over my life anymore. I turned my back on them entirely. I told Miller to physically remove the trespassers from the premises immediately. I walked purposefully back toward the glass elevator. I did not look back even once as Miller and the highly trained security team aggressively marched my protesting family out of the building and physically pushed them out onto the cold, rainy Seattle sidewalk. The elevator doors slid shut with a soft hiss, sealing me back in my sanctuary. The twist was not just that I was the ultimate boss. The beautiful, poetic twist was that they finally, agonizingly realized they had spent 10 years abusing, draining, and belittling the absolute only person on earth who could have ever actually saved them. Actions have profound, unavoidable consequences. For a very long time, my entire family existed in a carefully manufactured, heavily insulated reality where Julian's terrible actions and financial blunders only ever resulted in my personal consequences. I was the designated shock absorber for his life. But when you finally remove the safety net, when you pull the rug out from under people who have never learned to stand on their own 2 feet, gravity takes over with a terrifying, devastating speed. Following the disastrous, humiliating incident in the main lobby of my corporate headquarters, I did not leave a single detail to chance. I knew their desperation would only mutate into something more dangerous if left unchecked. I immediately hired the most ruthless, aggressive, and expensive corporate lawyer in the entire city of Seattle. I paid a premium retainer. Within 48 hours of their physical removal from my building, my lawyer drafted and formally served comprehensive, ironclad cease and desist orders to my father, my mother, Julian, Qley, and my treacherous, backstabbing cousin Leo. The heavy legal documents, delivered by process servers to their respective doorsteps back home, explicitly outlined that any further contact, whether in person, digitally, via telephone, or through third-party proxies, would result in immediate, devastating civil litigation. We cited harassment, severe emotional distress, and documented attempted extortion. The paperwork included still frames from the security footage of Julian attempting to steal my deed, just as a friendly reminder of the leverage I held. The imminent threat of a massive, bankrupting lawsuit finally built a concrete wall they simply could not scale. The screaming, the demands, and the unannounced visits stopped instantly. The silence returned, but this time it was enforced by law. It was permanent. I did not actively seek out information about their subsequent downfall. I did not hire private investigators to gloat over their misery. I simply focused on my company and my life with Evelyn. But I didn't need to dig for information. In the modern era of interconnected social media, public records, and loose-lipped extended family members who love to gossip, bad news travels like a massive, uncontrollable wildfire. Over the next 2 years, the inevitable total collapse of Julian's life played out exactly as anyone with basic financial literacy could have easily predicted. Without my regular, massive monthly infusions of cash to artificially inflate their lifestyle, and having thoroughly exhausted our parents' extremely limited retirement savings just to fund their pointless, failed extortion trip to Seattle, Julian and Qley hit a solid, unforgiving brick wall at 100 miles an hour. The very first domino to fall was the real estate. They absolutely could not make the massive, exorbitant monthly mortgage payments on the luxury townhouse they had been renting to own. The bank, unswayed by Qley's tears or Julian's empty promises of future consulting wealth, initiated aggressive foreclosure proceedings. They were formally evicted. They lost the beautiful property, they lost the entirety of their initial deposit, and their credit scores were utterly destroyed. The extreme financial stress of losing their home ripped the pristine, filtered mask right off their highly toxic marriage. Qley, finally realizing with cold clarity that the easy gravy train had permanently derailed and that Julian was entirely, fundamentally incapable of providing the lavish lifestyle she demanded for her fake social media brand, filed for a highly contested divorce. The divorce proceedings were notoriously ugly. There was absolutely no grace, no dignity, and no amicable separation. Qley completely abandoned her sweet, fake influencer persona and fought like a rabid, cornered dog for whatever pathetic scraps of money and assets were left in their accounts. The custody battle over 7-year-old Tyler and 5-year-old Madison was brutal, extremely public, and emotionally scarring for everyone involved. Qley ruthlessly used Julian's spotty, embarrassing employment history, his lack of any stable residence, and his documented history of financial instability to easily secure primary custody of the children. Furthermore, her lawyers managed to leverage his previous financial mismanagement to legally force the immediate repossession of the pristine Porsche Macan. The tow truck literally pulled it out of the driveway while Julian watched. The court left Julian with absolutely nothing but a massive, insurmountable pile of high-interest credit card debt and crippling alimony payments he could never hope to afford. Julian, completely stripped of his beautiful wife, his children, his luxury car, and his fake, pretentious businesses, had literally nowhere else to go. At 40 years old, the former golden child, the man who was supposed to be the brilliant success story of the family, was forced to pack his few remaining clothes in black plastic garbage bags and move back into the small, damp, unfinished basement of my aging parents' house. My parents had sacrificed everything for him. They had completely alienated and abused their youngest son. They had burned through their entire life savings, and they had permanently destroyed their peace and comfort in their golden years, all to fiercely protect a man who aggressively refused to ever protect himself. Now, they were eternally trapped in a small house with him, forced to witness the daily, miserable reality of the monster of entitlement they had created. The ultimate, pathetic confirmation of their absolute, rock-bottom desperation happened roughly a year after the divorce was finalized. I was sitting at my desk when I received a frantic, unhinged email. It came from a brand-new, anonymous email account, but the cadence of the writing was unmistakable. The urgent subject line in all caps claimed it was an absolute family emergency regarding my father's life. The body of the email stated, with dramatic flair, that my father was currently in the intensive care unit at the hospital, that his health was rapidly failing due to a massive heart attack, and that I needed to wire $20,000 immediately to cover emergency medical expenses or I would be planning a funeral by the end of the week. It was a blatant, repulsive, entirely fabricated scam. It was Julian, hiding like a coward behind a fake email address, trying desperately to weaponize the sacred concept of death, and a funeral to bypass my lawyer's cease and desist order and extort quick cash. I did not reply to the email. I felt a wave of profound disgust, but absolutely no panic. I immediately forwarded the email directly to my legal team to add to the thick harassment file we were keeping. A quick, routine public records check by my corporate investigator confirmed exactly what I suspected. My father was perfectly healthy. In fact, he had been actively, loudly complaining about property taxes at a local, televised town hall meeting that very same evening he was supposedly dying in a hospital bed. They had actually reduced themselves to faking terminal medical emergencies for a desperate payout. It was incredibly pathetic, deeply embarrassing, but it was the exact, precise karma they had meticulously built for themselves over a decade. They had spent 10 long years violently teaching Julian that he was completely above the rules of reality, that consequences were for other people, and that someone would always bail him out. And now, harsh, unyielding reality had finally handed them the massive, unpayable bill. True, lasting healing does not actually come from watching the people who deeply hurt you suffer. The initial novelty of karma, the brief flash of vindication when you see your abusers face the consequences of their actions, wears off incredibly fast. It leaves you feeling empty if that is all you focus on. True, profound healing comes from the quiet, powerful realization that their ongoing suffering is absolutely no longer your responsibility, and that your future is a massive, beautiful blank canvas that you get to paint entirely on your own terms. 5 years after I walked out of that toxic house, drove through the dark night, and crossed state lines to reclaim my sanity, my life in Seattle had solidified into something deeply beautiful and unshakably permanent. Evelyn and I were married in a small, intensely private, incredibly elegant ceremony overlooking the majestic, snow-capped mountains of the Pacific Northwest. We did not invite a single member of my blood family. There were no empty chairs left out of guilt, no lingering tension in the air. The day was absolutely flawless, surrounded only by chosen friends and colleagues who genuinely loved and respected us for who we were, not for what we could buy them. My software company continued to thrive and expand globally, providing me with a level of generational financial security that ensured I would never, ever have to worry about a leaking apartment roof, a broken radiator, or the terrifying anxiety of living paycheck to paycheck ever again. But the most profound, life-altering shift happened internally, deep within my own mind. For years, my entire identity was tightly wrapped up in being the silent victim of my family's relentless financial abuse. I was defined by the deep trauma of the stolen $60,000. I carried that spreadsheet in my mind like a heavy cross. But as time passed, and as the physical and emotional distance between my incredibly vibrant new life and my old, suffocating nightmare widened, I realized I had to actively let the burning anger go. Holding on to the intense rage was just another, more subtle way of letting them live rent-free in my mind. It was giving them power they no longer deserved. I received one final, unexpected piece of correspondence from Julian. It managed to bypass my extensive digital blocks and legal barriers because it was a physical, handwritten letter mailed directly to the main reception desk of my corporate office, without a return address. My security team carefully screened it, verified it wasn't a threat, and handed it to me in a sealed plastic envelope. I sat alone at my massive mahogany desk, looking out at the city skyline, and broke the seal. I unfolded the cheap, lined notebook paper. The handwriting was incredibly shaky, a stark contrast to his usual arrogant scrawl. It was not a demand for money. It was not a manipulative, tear-stained plea for a dramatic rescue. It was a genuine, utterly broken apology. Julian wrote that hitting absolute, undeniable rock bottom, losing his wife, his kids, his home, and his dignity, had finally violently shattered his lifelong delusions of grandeur. He admitted, in plain ink, that he had viciously used me. He admitted that he had systematically stolen the best years of my youth. He acknowledged that he had gladly allowed our deeply flawed parents to enable his absolute worst, most parasitic instincts while destroying my life. He stated clearly, without any caveats, that he did not expect my forgiveness, and he explicitly wrote that he was absolutely not asking for any financial help or a job. He said he was working 2 grueling minimum wage jobs just to pay his court-ordered child support. He just wanted to put it on paper, for his own conscience, that he finally knew he was the true villain of my story. I read the letter twice. I traced the shaky ink with my eyes. I felt a strange, quiet, deeply settling sense of closure wash over me. I did not write back. I did not call him. Forgiveness does not ever require an emotional, cinematic reunion. I forgave him silently in my own heart, permanently releasing the toxic poison of hatred from my veins, but I maintained the absolute, impenetrable boundary I had built to protect myself. I would never sit at a crowded Thanksgiving table with them again. I would never share another holiday, birthday, or milestone with the people who saw me as an ATM. The bridge was completely, intentionally burned to ashes, and I had built a thriving, beautiful city on my side of the river. Instead of dwelling on the dark inheritance of emotional trauma my parents had tried so desperately to force upon me, I focused entirely on the bright, secure legacy I was actively building with my brilliant wife, Evelyn. We started talking seriously about starting a family of our own. We sat down in long meetings with our top-tier financial advisors and established a massive, heavily protected college fund for the children we had not even had yet. We drafted ironclad, highly specific legal trusts and wills with our lawyer to absolutely ensure that the vast wealth I had built would only ever be used to empower, educate, and support our future children, and never to enable laziness or cripple their ambition. We were actively, legally breaking the generational curse of our family tree with binding documents, clear, honest communication, and unconditional love that absolutely did not come with a demanding price tag attached. I share this entire, ugly, triumphant journey with you not to arrogantly brag about my corporate success, or to flaunt my salary and real estate portfolio. I share this story to shine a blinding, undeniable light on the terrifying reality of toxic family dynamics. Society constantly conditions us, through movies, books, and guilt trips, to believe that blood is thicker than water. Society tells us that you must willingly set yourself on fire just to keep your family warm. But that is a profound, dangerous lie designed specifically to keep empathetic people trapped in an endless cycle of abuse and manipulation. You are entirely allowed to walk away from people who only view you as a disposable resource. You are absolutely allowed to build a massive, unscalable wall to protect your peace, your hard-earned finances, and your mental health. Sometimes, the most profound, courageous act of self-love you can possibly execute is packing your bags in the dead of night, blocking the numbers of the people who share your DNA, and disappearing to build the beautiful, peaceful life you actually deserve. Have you ever faced something similar with your own family? Have you ever had to draw a hard, unforgiving line and cut off people who were systematically draining your life away? Share your story in the comments below. Let this be a safe, supportive community where we actively validate each other's boundaries and celebrate our escapes. And please, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe so you don't miss the next journey we share together. Thank you so much for listening, and always remember, your peace is invaluable, and it is always worth protecting. Da Hon Tan Siu Chuyen, Tong Sotu, 6358.